What's your artisans? Welcome back to part 2 of my misadventure building a late Victorian era Bliss Dollhouse from a kit by Nordquist Designs. If you missed part 1, I covered a brief history of dollhouses from the 16th century to the end of the 19th century. I also went over the contents of the kit, the materials needed, and nerded out on some pedantic historic details. A link is in the description if you would like to view it first. Without further ado, let's get to work assembling this adorable dollhouse from 1901. What cheer artisans, we're ready to do this. I'm really excited about this project. First things first, we have to prep this for painting because that's the first step, which would be puttying any crevices or cracks that are in the wood. Very common with plywood along the edges for there to be some cracking, so that's expected. While most of this will most likely be covered by the cardstock, I'm a little OCD about it, so I'm going to putty and then sand it down to even it out before I paint it. But before I can putty, I have to cut off that piece of the roof to enable the door to open further. Right now it's about 45 degrees. I want it to be here to 90 degrees. In order to do that, this little piece of the roof has to be cut down until I get my desired angle. I'm not exactly sure how much roof I've got to work with here. The original was not designed quite this way. The roof did not overhang like that. The roof was flush to the rest of the building. There was a piece of trim there that was then cut on an angle to accommodate the door swinging open and closed. A little bit of a design change there. I'm thinking it was for ease of production of the item and also for user friendliness. I don't know what the reasoning and the logic is, but I'm assuming it was probably just for ease of manufacturing. This is all being done by hand, which is quite clear from the way the pieces are constructed, and also in the instructions it mentioned that all of the graphics have to really be customized to the house. So that's what goes with handmade things, but that's what makes them awesome because they're one of a kind and you can see the mistakes, which as I say, mistakes are a signature. So, okay, so that was a bit of a rant. Okay, back on track. Cutting the roof proved to be more arduous and time-consuming than I anticipated. Honestly, I can't see how you can paint and paper the interior of the house without cutting the roof so the door opens to 90 degrees. So I think this was a necessary step. Plywood is quite hard, but once a groove started to form, sawing was pretty easy, though it did require a lot of elbow grease. I had to do several iterations of cutting the roof, seeing how the door opened, and going back and forth. My hobby knife is flexible, so perhaps if I just repurposed, say, a jigsaw blade, it would have been less unruly and maybe have gone a little faster. I completed the job using sandpaper since I had better leverage and I had to smooth down the edges anyway. Now this is just for the sake of evening it out so that piece doesn't look like it's been bent. It looks like a bent piece, it looks like a warped piece of wood. Before I commenced puttying, I needed to glue one corner of the base since the plywood was splitting so severely it was starting to flake up. The glue ensured it wouldn't break off when I puttied. I also decided to remove the hinges from the house so the door would be separate for ease of painting and papering, as I felt the door would be a nuisance to deal with even though I cut it open to a 90-degree angle. This is not recommended in the instructions, but I was confident that I could deal with any complications from removing the hinges. The hinge screws are Phillips head, which didn't exist in 1901, as they weren't invented until the 1930s. Based on extant examples, nails were most commonly used. The screws holding on the front porch were flathead screws, which were used in 1901, so this is historically accurate. I filed down the hinge screws so they were flush with the wood to avoid any damage to the cardstock. The ends were quite sharp. Puttying is not part of the instructions, most likely because the objective of the kit is to make an antique reproduction, but I wanted to make a newer looking reproduction, so I wanted to get as many nicks and gouges repaired as possible. I used a latex-based putty, which did not exist at the time. There were many recipes for putty in the late 1800s, but my favorite is one my father learned from an old-timer when he was coming up in the trades: sawdust and glue. I found such a recipe in a book from 1887. It is exciting when you experience history yourself via the transfer of knowledge passed down the generations.
Based on the timeline, my father's mentor would have learned this recipe from someone working in the late 19th century. I think that's pretty cool. I wish I had a smaller putty knife because I knew I was putting way too much putty on, but it was hard to manipulate it. Once the putty dried, I sanded, and sanded. At the end, I wiped each piece down with a damp cloth to remove any excess dust. I also filed the screws that came off the house to ensure they wouldn't pierce the cardstock once I screwed the door back on.
Okay, dear artisans, we're at the painting phase. Super excited about this. I want to turn this dull-looking shell of a house into a Technicolor dreamscape of Victorian dreams. I expected there to be a lot of imperfections, even with me going over it with the putty, or at least a good amount of imperfections, as would have been the case in the production of these dollhouses back at the turn of the 20th century. They're handmade, wood does chip and split, and these dollhouses were being produced on an assembly line, they were being stored. So I can only imagine what they looked like brand new. One would love to find one, though. I don't know of any in existence, but that doesn't mean that there isn't one. I'm super excited about really bringing this house alive and seeing what it looks like, because I actually am a little tired of looking at it in its raw form, because I'm dying to make this house. So let's make this happen, artisans, and let's get our paintbrushes out and let's ring-a-ding-ding and get to work. Don't know what I'm doing. I'm being silly. Silly's good. And praise of folly.
The directions call for 5 colors: burnt sienna, a non-metallic golden yellow, a seafoam sea glass green, red, and gray. As I explained in part 1, acrylic paint wasn't invented until the 1930s. I did not use oil paint due to not having a proper workspace for such an endeavor. So I opted to not be so historically pedantic and used the craft paint as prescribed. I put 2 to 3 coats of paint on depending on which part of the house I was working on. I did the most coats on the roof to ensure an even coverage. While most of the interior and exterior of the house would be covered in cardstock, painting along the edges wherever there would be cardstock ensured the graphic blended in on the edges where the wood would be showing. The directions were organized by color, so I went from one color to the next according to the list provided. I skipped around if I had to let the paint dry before adding another color. I only hit a snag when I got to the last color on the list, gray. It said to paint the back of the base gray. I had already painted the edges green as it indicated in the directions, so while this wasn't a big deal, it was most certainly a waste of paint and time. I think better organized instructions would have avoided this. As a last painting step, I touched up the edges. I'm done painting. There were definitely some imperfections, and I think I'm just going to have to live with it. Isn't that the whole purpose of me going on these crafting misadventures, is learning not to be perfect, and I'm making these with my hands, so they're not going to be perfect. So the next step is to cut out the graphics and cut them to size based on the dimensions of the house. They're not cookie cutter because, once again, these are made by hand, so they're not perfect. I'm hoping I don't mess it up because I can't. I saw that they did give you a few to practice on, like with different things. Let me just do that. Cutting and fitting the cardstock to the wood took several iterations. Since all pieces are handmade, the cardstock has to be custom cut to each piece, meaning in some cases, you have to remove some of the graphic for it to fit. The directions said to cut them slightly smaller so no cardstock would overhang the wood and cause damage to the graphic. I made a mistake on the kitchen wall graphic. I cut off too much on the bottom. I painted the bottom of the wall yellow to remedy this error. It was that or have the trim be misaligned, and I preferred the former. Once again, everything went smoothly until I got to the keyhole. There were detailed instructions next to each graphic. The keyhole had a couple of paragraphs, since aligning the graphic properly would be more challenging. They provided an extra graphic because of this. I really struggled with this. I didn't fully understand what the instructions were trying to say, and my 2 attempts didn't look anything like the sample photo provided. I thought initially that my keyhole was just shaped differently, so that the gold banner around the hole wasn't even. However, after I had already started gluing the graphics onto the wood, I noticed additional instructions on the keyhole in the main instruction booklet that said you may have to go past the wood to achieve an even gold band in some cases. I was so annoyed. Why wasn't this information on the cardstock with the other instructions? Anyway, I thought on my feet, and with some photoshopping magic and a trip to Staples, I printed 3 additional copies to get the job done correctly. It took 2 more attempts, but I was finally victorious. Gluing with the Yes paste was a dream. I wished I used a better brush though, since I was constantly fishing out bristles. I found it was a better method to put the glue on the wood, then position the graphic, since you can move it around a bit before it adheres. I only put glue on the graphic if it was small or in an awkward area. A note on the dormer windows. In the excellent examples that I've seen, the windows are much wider. There's about half of a pane of glass on either side of that main pane that you see here. I don't know why they designed it this way, but I just wanted to note that it was a discrepancy from the excellent examples that I've seen. The graphics were crooked to begin with, so I did my best to even them out, but in some cases, they just had to stay crooked, but I was okay with that. It adds a bit of charm. Papering the inside of the house was a bit tricky in terms of getting the glue all over the graphics. I did my best, but I did have to wipe off some of it very, very gently. Once the outside graphics were applied, I had to punch holes where the door opener would be located and where the screws for the hinges would be. The instructions call for you to do this before so you would know where the holes were, but I actually found it was easier to do it after you glued it, as long as you didn't glue the other side and block the hole.
Okay, so now we're at assembly, finally. This project has taken me way longer than I expected. I would say the biggest challenge are the instructions. Now, this could just be me, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, but I found these instructions so confusing, so disorganized, in some cases as clear as mud, which is why it took me 4 attempts to get the keyhole, oops, that's the wrong side, to get the keyhole correct, because the instructions were just not clear to me and disorganized, and information was in one place but not in the other. Biggest criticism is that clarify the instructions. And I know in the reviews people said that in general for their kits the instructions are clear and great. I do not have that sentiment. However, I do think the kit is great. I am going to forego their so-called phase 5 of waxing the outside. I did order the brown shoe polish, as I mentioned in part 1 of this video series. I also ordered a neutral clear polish in the same brand. In the instructions, it said that if you weren't going to use the brown polish to further age and antique the house, to at least protect the graphics with the clear. However, this is oil-based. I did a test. The brown doesn't look so bad, and it did color it, and it didn't take as much of the graphic off as I thought it would, and I think probably because of the pigment in the shoe cream, that's why it's not quite obvious that that's what happened. I love the vibrancy of the colors in the graphics, so I don't want to do this to it. This is with the clear, it comes right off. It takes the graphic right off. Now, it's kind of strange that you would want to protect the graphics while aging the graphics and actually degrading them at the same time. So these two things are a little bit contradictory. I think if you truly wanted to preserve them, I would probably maybe coat it in Mod Podge and matte Mod Podge and call it a day. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to leave it the way it is, and it'll just naturally age from being out and about, probably through UV light that gets into the apartment. So I'm not going to do either because I don't want to take any more pigment out of the graphics, and I don't want to age it with the brown. I am skipping that step entirely, and we are going to assembly. Now, the assembly instructions, they really talk about reassembling the porch, and that's really detailed instructions, which I appreciate. However, everything else they don't really say. Looking at extant examples, that house was definitely attached to the base. It was nailed to it. And the stairs, there are two different bases. You'll see the one in the catalog, and then the one that's featured here. Obviously, it came from a different time. I've seen extant examples of both bases. It's hard to say which base came first. The 1901 catalog has the base where it's just 3 pieces of wood, a top and 2 sides, with the stairs attached to the front. I don't know if it's a case of value engineering like we see today, where maybe the earlier houses had the elaborate base that's recreated here, or it came after the fact. So is this version of the house newer or later than 1901? I certainly know it's not from exactly 1901, but that's the date I'm using because that's the date that I have the record of.
I used Aleene's tacky glue to attach the trim, keyhole, windows, and porch. This last piece of red trim didn't fall flush onto the other piece of wood, so it was very, very futzy. Fortunately, I was able to reposition it quite a bit before the glue started to adhere. I had to file a little bit more off the screws so it wouldn't pierce the cardstock on the first floor in the kitchen. It was very little though. I can see why the directions recommend you don't take the hinges off. It is very futzy getting it back on to fall just correctly and for the door to be slightly higher than the rest of the house so it can swing freely. I would recommend next time writing down exactly the order I took the hinges out and what position they were in, because I had to reposition that top hinge a couple of times to get it right. The door was still sticking a little bit, so I sandpapered the bottom so it would glide more smoothly. As I mentioned in part 1, the interior of the dollhouse is wallpaper from the 1894 McLoughlin folding dollhouse. Here, we have the corresponding paper furniture that goes with it. The folding dollhouse was originally 4 rooms, so this kit includes furniture for a kitchen, parlor, and a bedroom. The Bliss house only has 2 rooms, so I'll be rotating between the parlor furniture and the bedroom furniture on the top floor. A late Victorian girl would have used scissors to cut out this furniture, so using a craft knife is an anachronism. The X-Acto knife wasn't invented until, you guessed it, the 1930s. I used it because it is more ergonomic for my hands. Fine scissor work can really bother my wrists, which is why I don't own a pair of scissors small enough for this type of work. After the furniture was cut out, it was scored and then folded with an ox bone folder. I colored along the edges with watercolor pencils to cover up any exposed edges of the cardstock. The directions call for markers, but this is what I had on hand. I glued the furniture together with barely art glue, which bonds quickly and dries fast. The precision tip made gluing the tiny flaps of cardstock a breeze.
Azrael here. I'm in charge of channel analytics. This bow tie gives it away, doesn't it? I'm very classy. I'm a classy kitty. I've noticed that most viewers aren't subscribers. Well, how dare you? If you like what we do around here, please subscribe so you never miss a video. It will end up being the most important part of your day. This helps us produce more historic content. Okay, I'm going to take a nap now.